Hi everyone, my name is Shawn Boyd and I'm the curator of archives at History Colorado. And today I want to talk to you about Colorado's role in the campaign for women's suffrage. 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which was the largest expansion of voting rights in American history, granting most women the right to vote in all elections. Today I'm going to talk about the conditions that led to Colorado's leading role in the national conversation around suffrage, Colorado's role in the conversation after 1893, some of the collections at History Colorado about suffrage, and what activities History Colorado is doing to commemorate the anniversary. To give us a little context, I want to talk about the history of the women's suffrage movement. So I'm just going to start with 1848 and the Seneca Falls Convention, which is that picture in the upper right-hand corner. At that convention, it was the first time that American women met to talk about getting more political rights. They passed something called the Declaration of Sentiments. Also for Colorado history, something significant is in that same year of 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo brought southern Colorado into the United States. It had been part of Mexico. The border was the Arkansas River through Pueblo and Canyon City. And what was interesting was women in Mexico prior to that treaty had more rights than women in the United States. So that may come up again in our later conversation. Then in 1861, you can see in the picture there, the state picture. The black line is the Colorado area. We became part of, the Denver area became part of the Kansas territory. The northern area up near Fort Collins was part of Nebraska. The western slope was part of the Utah territory. And the southern part of Colorado, which should be more of a diagonal line, was part of the New Mexico territory in 1861. But the majority of the population in Colorado was part of Kansas. And Kansas became a state in 1861, and they were the first state to allow women to vote in school board elections. And that became true of the territory of Colorado as well. Now, obviously, between 1861 and 1868, quite a few things happened, including the Civil War. And after the Civil War, there were a couple of amendments that passed, 3 amendments, in fact, the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendment, and they were meant to bring the formerly enslaved people into the United States. But the 14th Amendment reads that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. Now that line, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, was later used to disenfranchise Native American women, but women throughout the country saw that as a potential door opening for them to be able to vote. There were women who attempted to vote in the 1868 elections, the elections after that, including Victoria Woodhull, who was a suffrage character. And the courts decided that the 14th Amendment applied to women as citizens, but did not apply to them as voters. And then in 1869, Wyoming managed to beat us to the suffrage game by becoming the first territory to grant suffrage in the state constitution in 1869. So Wyoming is officially the first state with women's suffrage in all elections, but that was passed by their state constitutional convention, which was more like a legislative body, and ours was a referendum. So in Colorado, the fight for women's suffrage happened fairly early, in that they tried to write it into the state constitution. We are the Centennial state. Our state constitution was ratified in 1876. It was not our first attempt at becoming a state, however, and previous state constitutions had been rejected by the federal government. And so the constitutional conventioneers, people in the convention, didn't want to be too radical in their movement of making Colorado a state. So women's suffrage suffered because it was seen as being too radical. However, there were some major supporters of that, including Edward McCook, who was the territorial governor at the time. McCook, Nebraska is named after him. He had been a Civil War officer. And other people who really were in the Constitutional Convention and fought for it were Henry Bromwell and Agapita Vigil. Henry Bromwell, his daughter, became a famous artist in Colorado. There's a picture of him on the lower right-hand corner. And Agapito Vigil was from the Trinidad area and was a representative of that area and was a major supporter of the suffrage as well, women's suffrage. So one of the outcomes of the Constitutional Convention was that they wrote into the state constitution that all people that were not previously laid out as being voters in the Constitution could be added by popular referendum. And so in 1877, a year after the 1876 campaign, they had the first campaign for suffrage. History Colorado actually owns the ledger book of the Colorado Equal Suffrage Association from that period. And it included some early supporters like John Evans, who was the territorial governor, Nathan Meeker, who Meeker, Colorado is named after, and he lived in Greeley. He was part of the Union colony in Greeley, which was a utopian kind of colony. And then William Byers, who started the Rocky Mountain News and was an early History Colorado board member, president. They were all early supporters of this 1877 campaign. And they managed to bring out the attention of Susan B. Anthony. That picture in the upper right-hand corner is Susan B. Anthony from about 1877. And Lucy Stone, who was another national suffrage leader with her husband, Henry Blackwell. And they came out here and actually campaigned in 1877. It was soundly defeated in that campaign. One county in southern Colorado only had 5 people vote for it. There was one county that passed it. You may actually be able to guess that it was Boulder. It was also popular in Greeley, but it was still defeated in Greeley. So 1893 is really when the suffrage movement took off in Colorado. And 3 things happened, including the suffrage campaign, which I'm going to talk about. But in chronological order, it starts with the World's Fair, which happened in Chicago. The picture in the lower right-hand corner there is the White City. That was the Chicago World's Fair. And this was a major event throughout the United States. One of the features of it was there was a women's building at the World's Fair, and Susan B. Anthony was there kind of presiding as a grand dame of women's suffrage throughout the country. And there were a number of Colorado women that were represented at the World's Fair who were also involved in women's organizations in the state. And they came as a delegation to Susan B. Anthony and said, we think we can get this suffrage. We think we can get it through this year in 1893. And Susan B. Anthony was not super supportive of that, but because she had been part of that 1877 campaign. But she decided to send her young protege, Carrie Chapman Catt, she was Carrie Chapman at that point. There's a portrait of her on the slide, who had been working with her to come out and be kind of a political advisor for the women in Colorado. Carrie Chapman Catt went and spoke all over the state. It was barnstorming was what that was called. And one of the stories was she went to a community in the mountains and she had to be in another community within like an hour. And they put her on one of those hand carts with the pump that went up and down and just sort of pushed her down the mountain, and she swore she would never do that again. But she spoke in over 100 places throughout the state, and was a major push for supporting women who were already working in the state. Another major factor that happened was the silver crash. So Colorado's economy had been based on silver. We had the largest set of silver mines in the country. Leadville was the richest county in the United States. And the U.S. decided to back their currency with gold instead of silver. So this caused a major economic panic in Colorado, as reflected in the upper right-hand corner. And it wiped out a lot of incomes and wealthy people. But it also caused people to think about the economy in a different way. The suffrage campaign really kicked off probably in July or August, got its biggest pushes in the newspapers in October of 1893. And of course, the election was the first week of November. And during that October period, women and men throughout the state were speaking at any place they could get a spot. They said later that they were doing it kind of underground and quickly. And part of it was because the Brewers Association was opposed to it, because there was this kind of idea that women's suffrage and the Women's Christian Temperance Union were tied in together. And so the Brewers Association understandably did not love the idea of prohibition. And so they thought that more women voting would cause prohibition to happen. So they were the main organized anti-suffrage group, along with the Catholic Church. So the picture in the lower left-hand corner shows one of the polling places in 1893, as well as people going and trying to round up people. They did actually get in trouble because they were standing too close to the polling places campaigning. They didn't understand that there was a 100-foot rule around the polling places even then, and that was noted in the newspapers.